Well, thank you all. We are moving apace through the day and coming to our final panel discussion of the afternoon. And then following this panel, directly after this panel, without break, will be very short closing remarks by our President, Father Leahy. So, and after that, more food and drink. To celebrate and continue that conversation afterward. So I invite you to take your seats now and join me for what we all expect will be a terrific conversation that we're describing as dynamic tensions, perhaps euphemistically. We'll see we'll see. But our moderator today is, we're really delighted to have Mark Oppenheimer, columnist for the New York Times, as well as a lecturer in English at Yale University, and he'll take over from here. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Can you hear me? Yes, all right, terrific. So yes, this was, it so happens, Eric, that I lost all the notes you gave me on the phone about what I was supposed to do, which is great, because then I get to do what I want to do. And let me just say, first of all, that as ever, you have these panelists' biographies in your brochure, and if we get tiresome, just flip through your brochure and read them. But I'll say briefly that Eboo Patel, to my right, whom I hadn't met before yesterday, is not only an activist, founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, IFYC, but is also a writer of some renown. And his first book won the, I don't know, does Louisville say the Graumeyer or the Grawemeyer?
Louisville says Louisville Graumeyer. Everybody else is Graumeyer.
The Graumeyer Prize for a work in religion, which is important to know because it's a lot of money. I mean, it's extraordinary. Like, he could have bought a really nice car with that money. And all of us, every year I get the press release from the Graumeyer people saying, it's embargoed, don't tell anyone for the next 3 weeks, but here's the next winner of the Graumeyer Prize in Religion. I actually know who this year's is. And I always think, that's a lot of money that I didn't win this year. So, congratulations. But his books are worth reading on their own merits. Susan Jacoby may or may not remember that she once sent me one of the most bilious, cruel emails ever. I mean, it was just nasty. She read something I'd written in the New York Times, totally misunderstood it, and then wrote me this very mean email. However, and I thought, that's awful, because I admire Susan Jacoby's work so much, along with people like Wendy Kaminer and Jennifer Hecht, and of course, some of the Englishmen, I think of them, Hitchens and Dawkins. She's one of the people who's been writing very serious stuff on skepticism and irreligion for a very, very long time, and her book Free Thinkers is one that you all should have. But I wrote back to her, and I said, well, I don't think that was very kind or thoughtful at all. And she wrote me the loveliest mea culpa and said, you're absolutely right. I was shooting my mouth off, and I didn't read your piece carefully enough. So I've had my warm feelings then redoubled.
That's not how I remember it.
Oh, you're taking it back? You're doing back?
No, because I remember the email, but I don't remember what it was about.
Okay, I don't remember what it was about. But, and then Nicholas Wolterstorff, who's the Porter Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology at Yale, and is now affiliated with the Institute for the Study of Advanced Culture at the University of Virginia, also has the distinction of having been one of the teachers who my junior year at college convinced me through his lecture class that religion was something maybe I ought to take seriously. So I certainly wouldn't be here today, but for that philosophy of religion undergraduate lecture. So it's an honor to be here with all three of these thinkers and writers. This panel was titled, very unhelpfully, Dynamic Tensions. And so I thought that in order to lend to put some meat on that bone, on those bones, says the vegetarian here, I would tell you about a column I wrote a few weeks ago. And when I wrote it, I thought, and I knew this was coming up, I thought, I want to know what those three people think of this column. So this will be a starting point, but then you, of course, may all have thoughts about tensions between Christianity and secular education that you want to share, and you should feel free to ignore my prompt. I was writing a column about Mark Regnerus, who is the sociologist at the University of Texas, who wrote the study last June that one of whose conclusions was that the children of parents who have had gay relationships do not fare as well on some indicators as children of parents who did not have gay relationships at some point in the children's upbringing. And there was a huge hue and cry about this study. And among other things, Dr. Regnerus was accused of being a tool for the Christian right, and was accused, he was accused of putting his scholarship in the service of his Christianity. And some of his partisans said that's ridiculous. He has a job at the University of Texas, a tenured job. He's a well-respected scholar at a secular institution. But then they said, well, but of course some of his funding came from the Bradley and Witherspoon foundations, and we know that they have an agenda that is unfriendly to the gay rights agenda. And then, of course, if you looked a little bit further, as I did, you discovered that at his last teaching post, and I forget what evangelical college that had been, but he actually had a website, which has now been disappeared by him, although the college, it's maintained in some archival form, but in which he had talked on the website about the proud place of a Christian in the classroom in addressing Christian issues and doing Christian scholarship. So I went around calling people and saying, is there such thing as Christian scholarship? What exactly could this mean to infuse your scholarship with Christianity? And I'll wrap up and throw this to you by saying I felt the answers were exceedingly incoherent. So almost nobody wanted to say, well...
You felt his answers were...
No, he wouldn't talk to me.
Oh.
But the answers when I called other sociologists, Christian and non, were very incoherent. So one or two of them said to me, well, it just means that by being a Christian presence at a university, you are modeling for your students that a Christian can do this, that it's a form of witness just to be outspokenly Christian, but it doesn't affect your scholarly program. And then some people said, well, it will affect the kind of questions you're interested in, but of course it won't affect the scholarship. There's no Christian way to crunch numbers as a sociologist. And then one or two people off the record said, well, in fact, Christianity infuses everything you do, even the way you crunch the numbers. And they were saying this was to the good in some cases. And of course his study is deeply suffused with his desired result, which was to cast some doubt on the gay parenting or gay marriage program. So it really just reminded me of all the things that my teachers talked about when I had Christian teachers in college, which was, is there such thing as, can there be a meaningful and reputable and rigorous Christian scholarship by secular lights, or is the whole concept useless?
Boy, do I want to answer
Okay,
that.
so
Boy,
do you want to take that first?
Yes. First of all, if there is such a thing as Christian scholarship or secular scholarship, the whole thing is a wrong idea to begin with. There are Christians who can do scholarships, and by the way, I also even hate the way the word Christian is used, because there are all kinds of Christians. So to talk about a Christian only in terms of this word that the right-wing Christians have stolen is ridiculous. Yeah. So there are Christians who can do scholarship, and to say that these values, if you're a Catholic scholar or a secular scholar or a woman who is a scholar or a journalist who is a scholar, to say that your core beliefs don't affect your scholarship, whether consciously or unconsciously, is nonsense. That is not necessarily the same thing as you have a desired result and you look for it, which, as we all know from some of the scandals in the hard sciences, is something that other people do as well. So I think this whole question of whether there can be a Christian scholarship or an atheist scholarship, I think that these are nonsensical questions. Are you an atheist doing your best to do honest scholarship and also being aware of what your own biases are? Are you a Roman Catholic being aware of your own biases and doing your best to do good scholarship? We are all something. We all have some beliefs. So I just object to calling it Christian scholarship. And I think that there is a role for religious colleges and religious liberal arts colleges, not because they're religious, but because they're good. And I think the best religious, historically based colleges are full of faculty members of that faith and of the other faculty members of other faiths who do their best to take account of their own biases, whatever scholarly project they're doing. And just one more thing, I do think that having this kind of a discussion about social science, which is just as I object to that term too, it's just as subject as the humanities, and as people who do bad science, hard science, to get into their conclusions. Just remember what Clemenceau said and apply it to social science and some other kinds of science. Military justice is to justice as military music is to music. That's it.
Nick?
Well, I don't, we'd have to talk more. I'm not sure whether I agree or disagree with Susan or partly agree, whatever. I mean,
well, that covers it all.
On this we agree, she and I. We all have a certain formation. We all interpret the world in certain ways. We all valorize certain things. That is, regard some things as of value and other things as of less value and so forth. To to be, one of you put it like this, we're born into the world, but from there on we acquire a sort of formation, which I think is, I've sometimes compared it to a musical formation. You get formed musically, and that's not just having ideas in your head, but it's learning to emphasize things, to note things, give things significance, and so forth. Okay, so we all have that. And that, it seems to me, if one is a scholar, at least in a field like philosophy, it's maybe not in computers, I don't know about that, but my field of philosophy, it shapes how you go about things. Let me give an example. 15 years ago, I was teaching a course in the history of modern philosophy at Yale. When I teach courses in the history of philosophy, I despise secondary textbooks. I've never used one. I want the primary texts. And I like a big chunk of the primary text instead of just golden nuggets. So I found a text that had a big fat text from Descartes through Kant, I guess, big fat chunks. We're teaching John Locke. I think the culmination of Locke's essay is book 4. And lo and behold, when I was standing in the bookstore selecting this text, a big book 4. So I thought, aha, this is it. So we're going through it, and I assign the students Locke's arguments for the existence of God, book 4, chapter 10. So we're talking about it. I'm talking about it. And they are whispering to each other and wiggling and so forth. So what's the problem? Locke doesn't give any arguments for the existence of God, they say. Well, of course he does, and I assigned him for today's discussion, but he doesn't give any arguments for the existence of God. So look at the text. Everything in book 4 has been reproduced, except chapter 10, Locke's arguments for the existence of God.
Jesus.
Now, it seems to me, look, I want to be candid about this. This strikes me as the bowdlerizing. You know what bowdlerizing is? The bowdlerizing of modern philosophy, the removal of traces of religion. So some of us gotten together and published an anthology from Notre Dame Press on the survival of the sacred in the modern philosophers, Descartes and Reid and Kant and Locke and so forth. So I want to tell the story of modern philosophy correctly. And it's my Christianity, my religion, which leads me to be annoyed by this deletion. Is that Christian scholarship?
No, that's just
no.
good scholarship. And anybody who's not a Christian,
right.
I would want to have that if I were teaching this course. It was part of his argument.
Right. So whatever it was, I was, given my religious impulses, I'm annoyed and not satisfied by this bowdlerizing. That, it seems to me, is very often, at least in my experience, how it goes.
But I'm just as annoyed by it, and I don't have any religious impulses.
What's that?
I'm just as annoyed by it as you are, and I'm not a Christian.
Terrific.
So, yeah,
But Susan, the problem is some people were perfectly happy with it. Obviously, I mean, the makers of the anthology.
And so let me tell a story which I think illustrates this as well. So at the College of Worcester, there's a philosopher there who tells a story of an exercise he does with this philosophy class. There are 20 of you on a life raft, and there are hundreds around you who are drowning, and you can only save 5. How would you choose the 5 to save? And he says that 80% of my classes will say we would try to save more than 5. Right? So you've all these idealistic 18, 19, 20-year-old young people saying, we'll find a way to save more than 5, and then Professor Cannon will go through what are the philosophical reasons you would do that. And he says that almost to a person, as he's writing this on the board, will give kind of a utilitarian reason. Because if we don't do this, then those hundreds will capsize the raft. In other words, they're trying to justify this in that utilitarian type way. He'll put the chalk down or put the marker down, and he'll say, would you really do that? And a good number will nod their heads, yes, we would really try to save the other people. And he'd say, tell me really why. And they'll say, because I'm Christian. And that's part of what we do as Christians and he'll say, why didn't you say that when I had the marker in my hand? And they're thinking, and they will literally explicitly say, that's not the kind of thing you say in class. Now, here's what I find fascinating about this, right? Clearly, Boston College, Wheaton College, many of the professors here at secular universities would not fall into this. Clearly, that way of thinking, that lens, that philosophical paradigm is invited into those classes. It is not invited in huge parts of the academy. That is a major problem, especially because huge parts of the academy take standpoint epistemology, it goes by 100 different names, very seriously. So black readings of Huck Finn, female readings of Moby Dick. Well, why not Christian readings then? Why not Muslim readings? In other words, if race, class, gender, sexuality are important identities, as they are, and if they are lenses through which you can view things such as philosophy and literature, can you not also view things through lenses of religion? I don't mean for this to move towards a hyper-fragmented postmodernism, right? I mean for this to suggest that I think the center of the standpoint epistemology movement is that we have a number of different formations which are based in very deep identities, and we ought to bring those to the table because they, first of all, they're real. Secondly, in a diverse democracy, if we're not bringing them to the table, we're hiding things. I think the larger question, right, for me, is what do we do with particular identities in a world of diversity? That's the big, that for me is the single, it's the central question of this conference. What does a Boston college do in the most religiously diverse country, some say in human history?
And I'm sure what you would add as well as I, we bring them to the table and allow them to be corrected. Don't just stand on a Hyde Park podium, but if I'm incorrect, if I misinterpreted the history of modern philosophy in some way, I've given it more religious import than it actually does have, I think it's got a lot more than it's traditionally, then I should stand corrected on that score.
Yes, and there's another question that might be asked, which is, I already said, you can only save 5. You can't save more than 5. What makes you think that the raft won't be capsized if you manage to save 7? Of course, nobody goes through these thought processes in a situation like that, really. But it would be interesting to know whether the Christian answer they gave the second time was any. Maybe the reason they would try to save more than 5 and capsize the raft is that they don't think logically, which I think is the real problem, that nobody trains people in critical thinking. And there's no Christian critical thinking or Muslim critical thinking, although there are different approaches to attitudes. There is logic, and you add to that and underpin it with whatever your religious or non-religious beliefs are.
So, I mean, one of the ways of looking at this is to ask the question, well, what's pedagogically useful to talk about, right? So, we all acknowledge that there are going to be Christians in our classrooms, Jews in our classrooms, a lot of secularists in our classrooms, a lot of people who say they're Christian but actually can't, if you ask them to name, several, 3.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's not the Gospels, it's hopeless, right?
Hopefully in that order.
Now, when you were my teacher, I don't recall that you ever said you were a Christian.
Probably not.
Probably not. What is now, I could imagine you're saying actually everyone should, if they have these ludicrous biases, they should put them out on the table. And what's pedagogically useful, given that we all have these biases, that we may be striving to eradicate or to have corrected?
Oh, I should say also, one reason I was happy to be invited to this panel is that since I wrote my first book that even touched on atheism, which it had very little to do with, Free Thinkers, I've been invited to speak at loads of colleges. 75% of those invitations come from historically religious colleges, whether Catholic or Lutheran, the few Episcopal ones that are left, or Baptist, which is to say American Baptist, formerly Northern Baptist Convention. And
the Southern Baptists never invite you?
Never. I've never been invited to speak at a Southern Baptist school.
It's because they actually read the books.
Right. No, there is. I do hear from Southern Baptist history teachers who say they wish they could invite me. But anyway, one of the things I've found out about the students is that students at these lectures know much more about my subject than the students at secular colleges where I speak to, because they do mention this. For example, at some religious schools, they will mention that the Constitution doesn't mention God, which when I go to a secular university and I tell an audience this, they are absolutely stunned by that. But I think that, first of all, I think that when the subject bears on, such as the John Locke thing, when it bears on it, I think that you should but if your students know anything, but you can't assume that, I think if you're an atheist or a devout Lutheran or a devout Catholic or a devout Jew of whatever Jewish persuasion, a Hasid you would know was a Hasid from the way he was dressed, but most Jews you wouldn't know that. I think that it's perfectly appropriate at the college level, certainly, and not only appropriate but necessary to acknowledge your own biases and ideas. I think that adds to the discussion. And I would say, since students are still, it's funny, they don't respect education that much, but they're afraid of teachers because teachers can grade them. And I think that students should be assured by their teachers, when they come clean about what their biases are, that they are not going to be downgraded for disagreeing with them about religion or politics. That is, teachers should assure them this if it's true. It's because it's not always true in this case.
So Mark, in the philosophy of religion course at Yale that I had you as a student, there were 80, 90 students, whatever.
About that.
I didn't see any point in sort of announcing I'm a Christian. What I did is just went ahead and taught what I thought was significant and important in the history of philosophy of religion. And the outcome of that was very different from how a lot of other philosophers would have taught the subject of philosophy of religion. I took you people through the medievals and tried not to make it seem antiquarian, but why would a medieval kid want to prove God's existence? What's going on here? And then Schleiermacher, the Romantics, and I remember vividly, finally we get to experience in Schleiermacher, and your whole class is sort of sitting there, their eyes are getting round, and oh, this is finally about me. This is not about belief. This is about experience and so forth. so it was.
Schleiermacher's better on drugs than exercise.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
So I just went ahead and highlighted what I, given my Christian formation, thought was important in the history of philosophy of religion, and tried to show why it was important, and invited objections and so forth.
So that goes to the idea that being a Christian scholar may be interesting only so far as it has connotations for what you're interested in, for the kinds of things you'd be willing, that you think are the important questions. I'm curious, Eboo, those students at the College of Worcester who you said told their professor, well, we're not permitted to have a Christian original standpoint to stand on. Where did they get that idea, do you think? I feel fairly certain the professor hadn't told them that Christian, preference utilitarianism permissible, deontology permissible, Christianity impermissible. So where did they get it?
So from the time I set foot on my campus in 1993 at the University of Illinois, which is a wonderful school, it's not in the vanguard of any social movement, right? So the fact that I was like deeply steeped in multiculturalism from day one of freshman orientation through commencement just shows how central that was. What I mean by that is you couldn't walk into a leadership program or a humanities class or a social sciences class without being asked to speak from your race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. It was hugely invited, and there were impulses all the time, and some of them were explicit about how Cretan and Neanderthal religious ways of knowing and believing were. I'll tell a very quick story on this. Well, I'll tell you the first time that kind of occurred to me the huge parts of the world that I was missing. So, like any good 18 or 19-year-old student, I would drive home, about a weekend every month or so, and I would bring my dirty clothes, and I would, hope for the Tupperware containers I brought back to be returned with hot food, and I would give my dad big lectures about multiculturalism and racial consciousness. And he would probably be thinking to himself, I'm paying for this. You do understand that, right? And
he thought, please go back to school.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I'm like, have you ever read Bell Hooks? Like, great aplomb. So, my dad is mostly good-natured about this, but at one point he says to me, Eboo, for, all your Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa, you're missing the form of identity that's driving the world. So the next time you want to show up and call me bourgeois and have us clean your clothes, will you please tell me how you're going to solve religious conflict, right? And I'm like, my dad is clearly stuck back centuries ago, and I get back in my car and I drive back south to the University of Illinois, and a week later I get a phone call from a close Jewish friend, and I can hear the tightness in her throat, and she's about to cry. She says, Yitzhak Rabin has just been assassinated.
Yeah, what?
Yitzhak Rabin has just been assassinated, right? And that's like the first opening of my eyes, honestly, to the evening news and to the role that religious diversity issues are playing in the evening news, which is mostly murder to the soundtrack of prayer, right? 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, 95 assassination of Rabin, 98 election of the BJP in India. The 1990s is the story of growing religious violence, and the diversity movement, which had taken over
2001, 9/11, Second Intifada, priest scandals.
All of this, right? But even in the 1990s, which we don't think about right now, of course, Sam Huntington sees this, and in my view, gets the conclusion wrong, but gets the beginning right, which is religion is a primordial identity, and people convene around religion. And I think back to my college years, and I think I am really glad for the robust race, gender, class, sexual orientation conversations. How is it that I went through 3 years at the University of Illinois and heard religion mentioned 5 times? I say that in the context here because one of the things that has been prominent in our discussions over the last 24 hours is the importance of religious literacy issues, that what you know about Islam should not come from the evening news or your Facebook news feed, right? That you ought to have an appreciative understanding of a fifth of humankind, and frankly, an appreciative understanding of the traditions that play an animating role in the majority of people's lives around the world, and the evening news is not going to give you that appreciative understanding. So one of the roles that college campuses play is a counter-narrative, and not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's part of the definition of being an educated person, right? The ability to have an understanding of a 1,400-year-old tradition with 1.5 billion people. Now, to go back to the title that I actually quite like, Dynamic Tensions, what does it mean for me searching for a latte on this campus at 8:30 this morning to run into a hijabi girl at Boston College? A college started in the mid-19th century to educate Irish Catholic boys who were poor kids who had never had a chance for education unless a group of Irish Catholic priests took the time to start a college. That, for me, is the most fascinating and dynamic tension. I want to say one more thing here, which is I think, in a room full of eminent scholars, I'm going to say something dramatic, which means you all are going to correct me. One of the great geniuses of American society is not just that it welcomes the expression of particularity. It doesn't see it as threatening, right? Your Catholicism, your African American heritage, your Muslimness. The expression of that identity is not only not seen as threatening, somehow America welcomes you to plant your seeds in this soil and to build institutions that serve the broader community. I find that stunningly inspiring. What would America do without its 600 Catholic hospitals, not a one of which turns non-Catholics away, right? 85 million people are treated every year in those 600 Catholic hospitals, 250 some Catholic colleges and universities, 7,000 Catholic elementary and high schools, one of which a young Zaid Patel, my son, wreaked havoc in for his preschool years on the north side of Chicago. So these are expressions of Catholic religiosity that in American soil serve the broader society. And I think that's a huge part of America's genius. And I think that dynamic tension between particularity and pluralism is something that we have to address as coherently as possible.
I agree with everything you said, but I'd like to tell you a story. Everyone has been talking about, and this may be true, that people feel that they can't say they're religious, let's say, on the college campuses of the Northeast. But I can assure you, and I only know this because I lecture at a lot of colleges in the South and the border states, that atheists, or even people who are religious but don't agree with the kind of religion they were raised in, feel extremely constrained, just as constrained as some Catholics at a highly secular university might feel about talking about their religion in terms of their scholarship, their values, even themselves as a person. Once I was lecturing at what was not a religious college, but all of the students were the children of fundamentalists in Conway, Arkansas. And the kids would come up. The fact that they came to my lecture shows that they were all practicing in their faith, but they were interested in other things. And they would say, I can hear their voices. They were so sweet. They'd say, I'm a Christian, but I believe in a woman's right to choice. or I'm a Christian, using it the way I'm a Christian, but I certainly believe that gay people should have equal civil rights with me. And how do I reconcile those things? And here I am, an atheist. I'm trying to advise Christian students how to continue to practice their Christianity. And I said, the main thing you have to realize, and you're young, you're going to be going other places, is you have to find a place where if you believe both of those things, you can say, they were all Christians, there were no Jews or Muslims, this is the Bible Belt. I said, there are lots of places and lots of environments where you can say, I am a Christian and.
Yeah.
And you have to find those places. And
Right.
that's certainly what I would say to somebody who felt that they couldn't say they were a Catholic or a Jew. But all I'm saying is that atheists, freethinkers, whatever you want to call them, feel just as constrained about expressing their beliefs in a huge part of this country as I am told that various Christians do.
Well, it seems to me that there are two reasons. We're talking about two different philosophies of what education is for. I mean, some of us think you should send, that, among other things, when you send your child off to college, that the college will reinforce and help fortify let's say, the faith tradition in which they've been raised. And the faith tradition, or the tradition, shall I say, may be one of skepticism. It may be atheism. It may be socialism. Or maybe it's Seventh-day Adventism, whatever. And then there's a whole school of thought about higher education, which is to say it should challenge you in ways that may actually crumble that may, not necessarily, but it should present the kinds of challenges that may be very, very bad for those sorts of faiths in which you were raised. And I'm not sure that the two are, it seems to me when I hear the scholars from Christian colleges talk, they want to finesse that somewhat. And I'd actually like to, are those two, can those meet? I mean, are those commensurate?
Yeah. So Mark, I'm going to hijack your question
Please.
a little bit. And say a few words about liberal education as I understand it, and then you can drop it as a lead balloon if you want and so forth. Back in my youth, when I was teaching at Calvin College, head of a curriculum committee, I tried to figure out what constitutes liberal education, and I defined it negatively the way some of us have. And I never felt happy with that, but it frees us.
What do you mean you defined it negatively?
It frees us from parochialisms. It is not aimed at a profession and so forth. Then one day, I shall never forget it, I was reading a passage in the sociologist Talcott Parsons, a little book by Parsons. I forget what the book was. And it was not about liberal education. It was about culture and society. And he happened to make this remark. He said that what's a striking feature of Western society for a good many centuries now is the immensity of the cultural heritage that we have that did not originate within our present-day society and has no obvious utility within present-day society. That struck me as a bombshell. This is fascinating. We have this enormous cultural heritage coming from all over the place. And I think, and that liberal arts education seems to me to be, in essence, inducting the students into some part of that heritage. We can't induct them into all of it, of course, but into some part. So it's more than just not something, it's that. And it seems to me, I've come to think that the worth of that does all kinds of good things to us. It improves critical thinking and creative thinking. I don't dispute any of that. But it seems to me, well, I've come to think that we've got to say something more about it. We are put in touch with something of great worth. I found myself, I think sometimes I expressed it in the philosophy class. This is fascinating. Isn't this interesting? A creative question and a truly creative answer. Whether you can do something with it, I don't know about that, but it presents to us these enormous achievements. In the case of the natural sciences, puts us in touch with a world of astounding intricacy and vastness. And I've come to think that liberal arts education, when it goes well, should then have an emotional basis to it. Students should find themselves awed. They should find themselves saying, awestruck with Dante, with Shakespeare, with Plato emerging out of nowhere almost, Aristotle emerging out of nowhere, be awestruck. And yes, given what historians tell us, they should also sometimes be horrified at what human beings have done to each other. So Yes, it's got all kinds of uses, but it's something that should awe us and horrify us. And if my students emerge never being awed, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this fascinating? I haven't been successful. That's how I've come to think of liberal arts education.
Right, and I think one of the worst things I've heard today, and I can't remember who said it, but it was at the last sort of edge of the last panel about finding ways of measuring the effectiveness of liberal arts education. Something like a scale of, yes, we can see that this person has better critical thinking on a scale of 1 to 5.
This is what Dante does to
right,
you. Yeah.
Right, this is what Dante does to you. This is how it changed this person's thinking. Or
I give your warmth and integrity a B+.
Yeah, exactly. I just think this shows how much that anybody who is a liberal arts educator can say that and believe that this is going to help, by the way. It's not going to help any more than when social science conflicts with people's preconceived ideas it helps, and we absolutely know that it doesn't, that facts don't conflict. Look at the proportion of this country that still believes that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, all things to the contrary, and this is true of measurements. I said this before in a question, but the value of a liberal arts education, whether it's provided within the context of a religious institution, religiously based institution like this one, or in the religious history departments of secular universities, it has to stand on its own. I hate to say this. I know somebody's going to laugh at me, you probably. But it is a matter of faith, and you cannot prove it to people, and you actually denigrate the value of a liberal arts education by trying to grade the change in people's views on 1 to 5. How much has this person, because we are teaching some of the classics in Arabic, how much have they improved in their understanding of the rest of the world? 1 to 5. No, these things have value because you believe they have value, because of what you said. And if, as a teacher, you don't feel confident that you've reached somebody, you never reach all people, especially in this society, it is valuable because we have to believe in it, and it is valuable whether you reach 10% of your students or 90%
Right.
of them.
And I suppose I should add, to be clear, there is something unspeakably corrupt about running a concentration camp in the day and listening to Beethoven at night. There's something unspeakably corrupt about that. But I don't think, but I don't want to say that that we should think of Beethoven purely in terms of utility.
So going back to the title of this panel, which, acceding to the fact that you liked it very much, what are the big dynamic tensions? So I'll suggest one. When the president of Wheaton College was sitting where you are, for example, and was talking about the education there, is he still here? Where'd Philip go? There you go. So I may be wrong in this anecdote. I seem to remember reading in the Times 5 or 6 years ago that my old college, we weren't friends, he was all right, but my old college acquaintance, Joshua Hochschild, was fired for becoming a Roman Catholic. Was that right?
He actually resigned, but sure.
He resigned, but sure. It was no longer, right? So he basically thought, still a very committed Christian. He'd become a Christian in college. I remember when that happened. And, let's assume the best about him, assume that through this, arduous process of self-searching and critical thinking and doing all the things that a liberal arts education at Wheaton or at Amherst or at Williams wants us to do, arrived at the conclusion that the fullest, or the truest expression of the Christian faith was Roman Catholicism. And for that, more or less, was forced out, lost a job. That strikes me as a problem, there's a place where the rubber hits the road, where if you're trying to create a certain kind of community that describes itself as Christian a certain way, and by the way, there are examples like that at other schools also. That's the one I remember. That at a certain point, that's a tension that I don't think, it seems odd to me that you can say to someone, we really, really want you to think freely and critically, but if you reach a certain kind of conclusion, you're no longer fit for our community. That's the one I think of. But you guys might have, what are the dynamic tensions you thought about when you saw that this was the topic?
So my guess is that knowing President Reagan a little bit, that he's probably given that an awful lot of thought.
He probably wasn't president when it
right.
happened.
But still, it's a fascinating and important case. And the question is, back to the language you used, Phil, is good sectarianism, bad sectarianism. I actually prefer the term particularity because I think sectarianism has a negative connotation. But so to tell a quick story and then to analyze from there. So I went to Berea College a couple years ago. It's this really special Christian institution in the American South in Kentucky that was started as an integrated black-white institution, college in pre-Civil War Kentucky, right? So I'm speaking in the chapel, and there's a big cross right behind me, and one of the sweet staff members at Berea College comes up to me and says, "Hey, I hear you're a Muslim. Are you uncomfortable with the cross behind you? Should I cover it?" And I thought to myself, God, this is the danger of particularity meeting diversity and thinking to itself, for you to be safe, I have to be less who I am, right? And I thought about this, like John Fee in the 1850s built this college, risked his life to have black students and white students studying together because he believed in a particular vision of that cross. And my sense is the reason that the college, under Larry Shin's presidency at that time, had brought a Muslim to speak about, religious diversity and social justice was because of their vision of that cross. I didn't want them to cover the cross. I wanted them to have a robust articulation of that vision of it, right? So I think that actually the intersection of particularity and diversity is this: the ability to articulate from your tradition, your relationship with other traditions and ways of being. It's not to say that for the Muslims and secularists and et cetera, to be safer at Boston College, we have to be less Catholic. It's to say that we have to have a full and robust articulation of a Catholic theology of relationship with other people or interfaith cooperation, whatever you want to call it, so that we actually highlight different dimensions of our Catholicism coming to light in a 21st century America that's more diverse than ever before. One of the things that strikes me is that in the past, generation or two, the ability of people to articulate theologies of poverty, of racial reconciliation, of environmentalism, has become part of what it means to be educated in that tradition, right? In a time of religious diversity and interaction and intensity, it feels to me like part of the challenge and opportunity of Catholic colleges and all religiously affiliated colleges is to be able to articulate how its tradition is in relationship with other traditions. That way, you have people who say, I'm proud to be a Catholic or an evangelical or a Presbyterian, and I don't feel like I'm bad sectarianism. I don't feel like I'm hiding away from the world. It's not faith as bubble. It's not faith as barrier. It's faith as bridge. But that takes an articulation, and who else is going to do that except for institutions like Catholic colleges that have a foot in the world of that diversity and a foot in the historic nature of their tradition.
But, and this is one, I completely agree with what you said, but here is another tension. And it comes as people who, particularly for people who've been educated only in one tradition, learn about others. And it was brought home to me most forcefully. That's why I'm so grateful I lecture, because I've learned so much. A few years ago, I gave a lecture at Augustana College, the historically Lutheran college in the Quad Cities area. And it was to their college freshmen. It was a freshman college history teacher who invited me, who was a Lutheran. Not all of the faculty there is Lutheran by any means, but he was. And after this student came up to me, a freshman, 18, raised in a very different kind of Lutheran home, a very literal biblical interpretation home, of a kind that a lot of Lutherans, probably the majority, are not today. And he came up to me afterwards, and he said to me, I understand everything you say about the reasons for not imposing your religious values in a society of diversity in which people have to get along and be governed by the same government who believe very different things about this. But how do I reconcile that with the fact that I know, and he used the word know deliberately, he didn't say I believe, which he might have, that I know I'm in possession of the absolute truth. How can I not want other people to have that too? And how can I not do my utmost, there's where you get into it, to see that they have it? Well, there's that word, to see. And I thought to myself, this is a really, and this, by the way, was somebody who 6 months before had arrived at Augustana wanting to be a minister, and now he wanted to be a high school teacher. Why? He'd already been exposed to a different idea of Lutheranism with his professors there. And I said to him, that is a question that everybody who believes they're in possession of the absolute truth has asked themselves throughout history, as I'm sure you'll find out even more than you already have in terms of your education. But I said, that's not a question I can answer for you. That reconciliation, which will include a question of whether there is an absolute truth, meaning that everybody else has to agree with it. I said, you're going to have to answer that question for yourself. And then along came the teacher and said, why don't you come to the faculty lunch we've arranged? And he did, and what he heard at that lunch. But I think that this was a great example of the tensions that exist even within these institutions. And he was learning, and what he'll decide eventually, I don't know. But certainly he was getting, as you said, something that a historically religious college, but providing a good secular education as well, is uniquely equipped to do precisely because they are concerned about religious belief.
Mark, can I tie my answer to your question into what Nathan Hatch said, one of the points Nathan made last night? I think one of an absolutely remarkable and I think wonderful feature of American higher education is its radical decentralization and the fact that we don't have a federal minister of education. In fact, most of the states don't have a minister of education. I taught for 5 years, half of each year for 5 years at the Free University of Amsterdam. And there you see in a European system like that, the radical contrast. There's a central ministry of education. All the universities are under that and so forth. So a remarkable feature of American education is that a bunch of people can get together and for really good reasons or for really goofy reasons decide to start a college. And they have to be licensed a little bit and so forth, but they decide, why don't we just have our students confine themselves to reading great books? We won't teach them any physics, we won't teach them any chemistry. Now, I think that's a kind of goofy idea, but it goes. And that's one of the great benefits of American education. But of course,
it's great to me. A school where they're not going to.
Yeah, okay.
I should have gone.
It's also a great weakness, though.
But of course, it's got the rub. And the rub comes then when, well, it especially comes when they are not clear to their prospective faculty, especially, and to prospective students and donors, but especially to prospective faculty, when they're not clear as to what the contours are that they want, what tradition they want to carry on, what particular vision of education they want to carry on, and so forth. So the first thing I want to say to all such colleges is you have to be absolutely clear as to what it is. There will still be painful things. People will change their mind and so forth. And one of the things that's going on now in the Wheaton case is that the old sorts of divides between Catholics and Protestants are breaking down in all kinds of ways, and old rules begin to look pointless. But I do want to say that what you point to is the dark side of something that's really to be celebrated in American higher education. You can get together and start college for goodness knows what reason. People show up, you find some donors.
There is a compromise, though, between some of the things about the European and American system, and I think we see this because of the lack of preparedness, because we don't have any national standards for elementary or secondary education.
Well, we're
either.
getting some.
True.
We're getting some in 2 years with the national core.
True.
But that's not going to be enforceable. But I don't think it's a great thing, and certainly I would object to any public money ever being spent, and all colleges get some public money indirectly, for a college which decides that a person can be an educated person, that they can issue a degree and teach nobody any science. I think that's ridiculous, and I think in that respect the European system is better. And I think that there is a compromise to be made between that between that and the idea that let's say Patrick Henry University can decide to set itself up to treat homeschooled children to become right-wing lobbyists in Washington. It's ridiculous to even call it a university.
But there's another downside with respect to our topic of liberal arts education, to the European system. In the European system, since it's run by bureaucrats, in recent years, England, Holland, I know best, it's becoming run by I was going to say efficiency experts, purported efficiency experts. And so they're even more relentlessly than in the States, they're asking, what is the economic payoff for it? The Dutch universities are close to eliminating all teaching of languages.
Oh, God.
Now, I find this just excruciatingly painful. The Dutch were in the Renaissance, the early Renaissance, the great linguists of the world. And now they're saying, makes no money in the modern world. We'll teach economics and sociology. Why exactly sociology, I don't know, but economics. So, yes, our liberal arts in the States are endangered by that mentality, but thank God there's no minister of education and there's no parliament saying you gotta all be efficient. The Yales and the Wheatons and the Calvin colleges can thumb their nose at it.
It's for everybody who can pay their tuition.
Yes, right.
That's a great place to maybe start taking questions from you. Does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Sir, wait. I'm going to make you wait for the microphone. Don't even think about talking for the microphone. Coming. There you go.
A quick question. Do you see a dynamic tension between diversity and freedom of association?
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by, like, for example, if a bunch of people decided to have a Bible study and say, we only want men who are Christians, do you want to force them to be diverse?
Right.
Or, things like that. Or some men want to play golf and they don't want their wife to come. Like, that's another example.
Imagine that.
Hypothetically speaking. Right.
So I think this is a terrific question, and it's going to be one of the great. It's long been one of the great challenges, and it's going to be one of the great challenges. And the specific case in which this is going to hit the fan is around universities' all-comers policies and particular religious groups' ideas of who ought to belong or who ought to run for leadership. And the stuff has hit the fan around Vanderbilt around this, where the InterVarsity group has been decommissioned or whatever it is, because they've said that.
Sounds like an awful
They've said that
euphemism.
Gays and lesbians can't run for leadership positions in our organization, which directly contravenes the university's all-comers policy, right? And I actually think, was it Isaiah Berlin who said that, look, the deal in a democracy is you have competing values, you have competing goods, right? And you can say both of these things are good. In this case, I think that a community being able to articulate its identity, I'm not making a judgment about what I think about that particular expression, but a community saying, we're a community, we have an identity, and we're going to articulate it, right? Here's what it looks like. And a larger body saying, actually, we are going to proactively redress what we think are unjust inequalities. In this case, around identity issues. In my view, both of those are goods, and the question is, which side wins and who has the power? This is only to say that the point that you bring up is a hugely important point, right? Which is and I just think it's endemic to a diverse democracy, and I think that universities are probably the best place to have thoughtful conversation and some, I don't want to use the word resolution, but some sense of the next step forward, because every one of those clashes every one of those, they play out in the broader society. Wouldn't you rather have a place where people can sit together that has an ethos of civil discourse and free speech and respect for identity and student leadership and building bridges, all of those things, and say, when you put all those things together, there are cases in which some things are going to conflict. So how do we resolve those cases?
So,
and also
which side, who was right in the Vanderbilt case?
So, honestly, I actually was at Vanderbilt 2 weeks later, and you know what I said? Try not to pick this fight.
Yes.
Hold on, let me finish this.
Who did you say that to?
I said that to everybody. I said that to everybody, right? And I will tell you, I will give you the the best example of where that wisdom came from for me. Martin Marty is a friend and mentor of mine and ours at Interfaith Youth Corps, and I go see him a couple times a year, and he says during the time of the Obama administration, Catholic institution fire around insurance plans and contraception, he looked at me and he said, the last conversation Catholic college presidents want to have right now is what is in my insurance plan. Honestly, most of them don't want to know. And they don't want to be told, they don't want to have this fight. Here's what I'm saying, that it is simply the case that the expressions of some identities are insulting to others, right? So if evangelicals were to say, which they do, we don't believe in gay marriage, right? That is insulting to gay people who want to marry. There are times when we have to choose to have different conversations, right?
Yeah, but
we don't have to have the fight all the time.
But I'm unclear what are you telling the Christian group to let the gay
No, you know what
are you telling the administration not to enforce their policy?
I'm telling the administration not to enforce their policy.
Even though the gay students have come to them and said...
No, actually, what happened in this case is, from my understanding of the case, is that somebody, and I could be getting this wrong, but that somebody went through the charters of all the student organizations, found a charter that didn't match the all-comers policy, and proactively went and said, we're gonna enforce this. Now, look, you might say that this is a ducking your head in the sand approach. All I would say is, my having thought about this for a year and having a lot of conversations about this, I don't know what the better solution is. Do you tell the Christian group, actually, we in the Vanderbilt administration are going to tell you that your understanding of Christianity is wrong? In other words, we're going to mess with your religious interpretation, or we're going to say that there are certain forms of identity, namely yours, that cannot flourish here in the form of your student groups, or are you going to say to gay students who want to be a part of that group and run for leadership, actually, when it comes to you, we're not enforcing our policy. What's interesting is that that policy was not enforced explicitly when it came to fraternities, which of course creates its own brouhaha. This is only to say, right, which I think is, and I'm happy for a better solution to this because I recognize that my articulation leaves everybody half full. In a diverse democracy, the expressions of some people's identities are hurtful, marginalizing, insulting, etc., to other people. The question is, how can those communities still live together? I think sometimes the response to that is, you have to not pick the fight.
Either of you want to address that?
There's another word for that, which I meant to say about the Wheaton situation. There's common sense. If you are a Roman Catholic, and it's not a matter that Roman Catholic identity is hurtful to Wheaton College, it is that Wheaton College is an evangelical college. It does not believe the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. If you are a Roman Catholic professor, there are lots of colleges who will welcome you as a professor and a Roman Catholic. Why should you think that a college which is explicitly evangelical, it is exactly as if someone decides, a woman decides to, and this would be hurtful, but a woman decides she should bring a lawsuit against a Hasidic yeshiva where everyone wears modest clothing because that's part of what a Hasidic yeshiva does. A woman who wants to wear shorts with her belly uncovered to a Hasidic yeshiva, and because this yeshiva is accredited by the state of New York, she decides to bring a lawsuit. There is a certain common sense, which is almost the same thing as, do I want to pick this fight? What is this fight about? Why do you want to go to a Hasidic yeshiva if you want to walk around with your belly button showing?
Susan, I think that for me, the center of the tension is that Wheaton College is very proudly an extremely particular type of institution. So is a yeshiva. The question is for a Vanderbilt or a Boston College, which seeks to be an institution which welcomes diversity, whose definition is there are going to be people here whose expression of their identity is hurtful and insulting to us, and whose full expression of our identity is hurtful and insulting to them. So the question then becomes, does Boston College become the equivalent of a yeshiva and say, actually, we're not going to have those people because we want to be entirely consistent and pure in our articulation, or does it say, we have to figure out which dimensions of our tradition we are going to robustly articulate and which we are going to hold for other conversations.
Yeah, well, and at Vanderbilt also wasn't saying to gays, we don't want you here. The question was about gays, obviously, wanting to run for positions in an organization which is antithetical to their own values. It's stupid.
Next question. In the green scarf. Yes, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
My name is Heather Hannison. I'm a PhD student in religion at Columbia. And I was wondering if any of you would respond to an argument like you find in Matt Crawford's book, Shopcraft as Soulcraft, that defends the value of manual labor for the expression of our humanity, especially in light of a New Testament teaching to lead simple lives, quiet lives, and to work with our hands.
I didn't quite get that question. Could you?
The question was with regards to Shopcraft as Soulcraft, the book about Shop Class as Soulcraft, about Matthew Crawford's book about working with motorcycles, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And how the virtue building effects of that. Would any of you, your question was, would anyone defend that as a necessary, important part of education?
No, it's great. It's great if you have the ability and the desire to do manual labor. I don't think. I mean, there are lots of forms of labor and giving away to your community that weren't possible in the times of the Bible. I don't know why anybody has to go to shop class to express their religious values, especially if they're bad at it.
And Matt Crawford got a degree in classics at the University of Chicago. So
Before going into motorcycle.
Yes. Well, the motorcycling is on the side.
On the side.
But I think it's a really interesting book.
I read it.
And there's a true value in that. I guess I wouldn't want to Well, here we go. Suppose a group of people gets together and they say we'd like to start a Shopcraft as Soulcraft College. I think a wonderful feature of American education is go do it.
Well, Deep Springs makes you do all sorts of there's all sorts
Berea
of
College used to do it. Let them.
It still does.
Let there be a Matt Crawford College. Why not?
Yes, right there.
It's Alan Wolf. So we had an election on Tuesday, and we had an election. We really did for president, and everyone's now talking about the changing demographics of the country, and that there's just going to be a whole new demographic mixture, and that's obviously true. But when I think about this whole conference last night and today, and about our religious colleges, it strikes me that, with the exception of Yeshiva and Brandeis, two Jewish ones, almost all of them are Christian. So outside of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish universities in America, what's left? So my question is, do you expect that any other religions in the United States outside those, the Judeo-Christian tradition, will create universities in the next 20 or 30 years? What role would they play as neither Christian nor Jewish? In other words, when are our universities and colleges going to catch up to the demographic reality of the country, which they haven't done yet?
Well, there is this attempt to start a Muslim four-year college in the Bay Area,
actually just
right?
reviewed the manuscript for that kind of an ethnography on the process of that. It's called Zaytuna College. It's led by some of the preeminent Muslim intellectuals in America.
And where would it be?
It's in California.
The Bay
It's
Area.
going to be part of the broader GTU. That's the idea. And there's actually a Buddhist college called University of the West. I think actually Kerouac and Ginsberg's tried to set up a college in Boulder, Colorado. So, but Professor Wolf, I'm fully with you, and this is kind of my very positive, optimistic view of American civil society, is that it is a place where identity-based communities can express their identities in ways that serve the broader society, and I think colleges are one excellent example of that. So right now, Zaytuna is not dramatically different from how my reading of what Boston College was in the 1850s and 1860s. It's very small, and it focuses largely on Islamic studies type things. But one day I hope that it's a Brandeis or a Boston College or a Notre Dame, that, in other words, it is the expression of Muslim identity in America that lifts up the dimensions of the heritage of Islam that are teaching and learning and intellectual, but that's for the broader society. And I hope that right now there's something called Claremont Lincoln Seminary, which is part of the Claremont complex, which is going to be granting degrees in religious areas in partnership with the religious communities. So in that way, it's kind of a traditional seminary, but that's using some of the intellectual and other resources of religious communities in order to grant degrees. I think these are all experiments at this time, but who knew 150 years ago that there would be a robust system of 250 Catholic colleges? So I'm hoping that the experiments that we're seeing right now flower into robust civic institutions in a couple of generations.
I think he's right, which is it's unusual for me. I basically believe in broader groups. I probably would not send my own child to I'm not sure though. But think about this. It's not only looking back to the 19th century. Joe Kennedy sent his boys to Harvard because the status of Catholic colleges then was such that he could not see them having the future if they went to a Catholic college. He sent his girls to Catholic colleges, which doesn't tell you anything about Catholic colleges, but tells you what Joe Kennedy felt about girls versus boys. But there has been such a huge change just in my lifetime in Catholic universities and what they do. I mean, I've just been amazed by what I've seen because my head was back in the stereotype. My parents would never have sent my brother or me to a Catholic college because they basically had Joe Kennedy's view of it. There is a lot of evolution, which I know is a word I can use here, that can take place, as he says, in what starts out as a parochial, in the literal sense of a word, institution. Would I want to send my own kids, if I were a Muslim, to such an institution? No, because I like Joe Kennedy, I would want them to have, but it would be both boys and girls. But the way that things start out in America isn't the way they have to finish up.
Very back row there. Yes. Wait. It's coming.
Misbehaving. My name's Susan Henking. I'm the president of Shimer College in Chicago, and I'm going to make a comment, then I have a question. I wish to speak in defense of the Great Books Colleges, at least the one that I teach at, because one of our proudest graduates left Great Books College to go to Harvard to do a dual PhD in physics and the history of science. We teach the science through historical text, but we teach science. Having said that, my question really has to do with another kind of dynamic tension, and that's the dynamic tension between the fiscal realities and educational mission. That's one. And then there's another one. That's between segregation and separation. Because one of the things we're not talking about here is the long-term consequence, for example, of anti-Catholicism and why there's therefore a strong Catholic tradition in higher education here. It was because in some parts of the country and for some periods of time, Catholics could not go other places. Same thing for Jews, right? And same things for women. So I'm coming back around to the finances in a minute. You could argue that today, out of the 4,000 higher education institutions, 1,000 of us are financially precarious. But of the ones that have closed, a disproportionate number of them are institutions where their populations that they marketed to can now go elsewhere. So, for example, many more women's Catholic colleges have closed, and men's have become much more coeducational. We all know Notre Dame. How many of us know St. Mary's, right? And there's a number of things that we could say about this. And I'm raising it in part because underneath some of this also we're debating what's the public good of higher education and how do we sustain a diversity of kinds of educational systems when the vast majority of institutions are poor. The institutions are poor, whether they're religious. Shimer's secular institution, in quite self-consciously secular institution. So I'm making comments and trying to also say there's some other dynamic tensions evident in the relationship of fiscal realities to educational mission, segregation to separation, right? We're not talking about the role of historically black colleges and universities, right? Or Hispanic serving institutions. Some Catholic institutions are very powerful at doing that. And so I think as we expand this out to interreligious dialogue, including the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, in the dialogue, we also have to think about what are the institutions we're not including in a dialogue about the place of religion or the place of non-religion.
That
Okay,
prompt-
it was a
does that
comment. not a
Prompt any
question.
thoughts from anybody?
Yeah, well, one thing, and this in a way relates to what Dr. Hatch said last night, which I agreed with partially, but not always. What we're not talking about here is public education, public higher education, which is not religious and is in a way, because they don't offer something special, something like Boston College offers, is in a much worse situation. And this relates to what you said, too. One reason I don't think we have any reason just to crow about the diversity of the higher education system is, first of all, it isn't true that the first colleges here were not dominated by the church. They were. Harvard was every bit as dominated by Puritanism as any religious college was, as any Anglican college was in England. And it took a long time for that to change. And this had the origins of higher education as church education had great impact on America, because I don't know how many of you know this, but George Washington in his will left a considerable sum of money to Congress to found a national university. He thought there should be a national university for everybody, preferably one that was free or that cost very little. Congress refused to do it because Harvard and Yale, then headed by Timothy Dwight, who certainly dominated his institution in a religious way, felt that to have a secular national university, one that wasn't controlled by the church, then the Puritan church, would undermine church education. We didn't get to real commitment to public education until the land-grant colleges. And I would say that we shouldn't get too... I think these are wonderful schools. I love them. I wouldn't have any money from lecturing were it not for them. But I think the formation of land-grant colleges was the biggest, most important step in American education, whereas the colleges which originally started out, and this has nothing to do with the greatness of historically religious colleges today, but the colleges that originally started out, being dominated by the church, they were not initially. I think the glory of American education is that it was eventually expanded beyond the church control.
I want to take one more question. Yes, Ben.
As probably the only person in this room who graduated from an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, I want to tell Susan Jacoby that my life would have been much improved by the presence of a woman with a bare midriff in my class. It never happened. It was a fond dream, I believe. I think there's a major tension. There's no way to number. I've been at Boston College for 34 years. There's no way to number the tensions. There are just too many tensions that exist within an institution like this, which has a religious commitment, as well as a scholarly commitment, as well as professional commitment, et cetera. One that we've missed that I think is very important is the conversation with culture. I will say that students at Boston College have an opportunity to meet culture, public culture, in a way that students at other colleges don't. And I attended secular colleges as well as my yeshiva. But for example, the hookup culture, which is prevalent. I don't imagine it's at Wheaton, but I'd imagine it's at a lot of places outside of those evangelical schools that have very tight control over student life. But it is prevalent at all Catholic colleges and prevalent at, I believe, I shouldn't characterize it. Well, this is an interesting tension. It's a fascinating tension. Here you are in an institution which you have freely chosen, unless your parents dragooned you into showing up here. 70% of our students, undergraduate students, are Catholic. They know what Catholicism means. They've been catechized. And here they are, and there's this tension between what popular culture says, I should say, what culture says, and what they're told here. And I think that's just a small example. But I think this conversation is extremely useful. It provides the tension that keeps Boston College, frankly, on its toes And even I, who am clearly not Catholic, who have a sort of sideline seat but in the front row, find it enormously interesting, more than interesting, to watch and to participate in.
One more question? Is there a question? Okay, yes?
Comment on that, or?
Let me take this. Let's get in one final question, and then we will wrap up. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Patrick Mann. I'm a PhD in theology and education here at BC. Just initially, I want to touch on something that Dr. Patel brought up, but this is for anyone in the panel. But Dr. Patel, at one point you mentioned that you did not personally object to lecturing in front of a crucifix. However, some years ago, there were a number of professors here at Boston College who objected strongly when crucifixes were placed around classrooms at the university, and I imagine that your view was not the only view. Many would take a different position. I think it raises an interesting point that in this panel today, and I'd say in the wider intellectual climate today, there's a growing sense that it is a good thing to have this plurality, out of which a number of groups can speak from their particularity, share what is good within those varying traditions in a way that will benefit the wider culture, the wider society. However, to put it this way, proselytizing is something of a dirty word. And I think this creates an interesting tension for Christians, certainly for a place like Boston College, who, a key tenet of the faith is go forth and make disciples of all nations. So my question for the panel is, how do we judge the difference or draw a line between sharing what is best in our traditions, offering what we have to share to the wider culture, and simply forcing our religious views on others? How do we helpfully set the terms of that discourse and for people's conduct in society?
We have 2 minutes total. Do you want to go?
Super interesting. I'm going to do 15 seconds on each. Your comment about the hookup culture and Catholic college campuses, I think, is fascinating. My sense is there's been 4 categories of discourse at this conference: the importance of continuing particular religious identities, the importance of embracing religious diversity, the importance of finding meaning through looking through religion, and then morality. The only thing that's been said about morality is it's important, right? Any reasonable religious view of morality would take a dim-eyed view of the hookup culture, which exists prevalently just about everywhere. So once you make that decision, the question is whose morality and who's going to enforce it. I don't think that we can just get away with saying it's important, we ought to do moral formation. It's a very challenging thing to do. Very quickly to your question, I think there are different dimensions, obviously, different dimensions to religious traditions. The Great Commission is clearly a huge part of the Christian tradition. So is the Great Cooperation. I think individuals and colleges make decisions about which one they're going to emphasize. My sense is that Boston College places more emphasis on what I'm calling the Great Cooperation, the dimensions of the Catholic tradition which would seek cooperation. Doesn't mean they don't believe in the Great Commission. It just means that it's not the first thing out of their mouths. My conversation with Phil Ryken, which has been going on for 2 years, is where does the Great Cooperation play in the ecology of Wheaton College? Could it have a role even though your most important focus is on the Great Commission? So I think it's which dimension of the tradition your campus chooses to emphasize.
10 seconds. I don't know how you solve that problem of proselytizing. Essentially, it's the same question the student asked me. I don't know how you solve it personally, but don't solve it by spending any of my tax money to finance it.
All right, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Nick, you were cut out there. Would you like to send us home, Nick Wolterstorff?
Nick,
did you want
Eric wants to know if you had any thoughts on the last question.
We cut you.
I don't have any thoughts beyond the good ones that were said.
All right.
Okay, good. Well, thank you to our panelists. This has been a terrific conclusion to the conversations today.